we've got some of our best and brightest going offshore.
Over 70,000 Kiwis now have left New Zealand. Birth rate is going down. The population is ageing.
I am very concerned about that.
If this continues, what is going to quietly break in New Zealand first?
There's a couple of things.
Professor Paul Spoonley is one of New Zealand's leading social scientists. He's an author, speaker, professor emeritus at Massey University. He has led pioneering research on demographic transformations and societal shifts, shaping national conversations on these critical issues.
We will quite soon be what's called an old dominant country, where over 20% are aged over 65. There's something called the old age dependency ratio, which is the ratio of people in work compared to those on superannuation. We'll go from 6 to 1, 6 and paid work to possibly 2 to 1. I'm really concerned about the small and medium enterprise sector, the SME sectors. The level of demand will exceed labour supply. We would be short of 250,000 people by the late 2040s.
Are we being naive as a country?
So,
Professor, over 70,000 Kiwis now have left New Zealand. Birth rate is going down. The population is ageing. It's the only question I would have right now for you is: are we slowly becoming a country that people want to leave and they don't want to build anything in?
Well, at the moment, that's probably true. But I think the major reason for the decline in immigration and for the departures is economic. So while the country has a soft labour market, unemployment and underemployment is so high, and while Australia is so vigorous in terms of its labour market, then we're always going to see that outflow. So about 60% go to Australia. We also have had a long history of people leaving the country. So for the last 30 years, there have only been 2 years when we haven't seen net outflows. But normally, in the last decade, 2010 to 20, the net outflow would be 3,000, but of course it's now peaked at somewhere in the mid-40,000s, and so I am very concerned about that.
I was just about to say, looking at New Zealand today, what worries you the most?
The lack of long-term planning. So I'm interested in our demography. I would argue that there's a new demography emerging. It began in about 2013, but it's really accelerated during the 2020s. And so this country is going to be quite different in the 2030s. In one sense, we're only catching up with a lot of other countries. So we're about 30 years behind Germany or Japan. You've mentioned declining fertility. We're down at about 1.5 at the moment, births per woman. Korea's down at 0.7. So there's countries that are seen a much greater fall. So in a sense, we're catching up with the rest of the high-income world. But I would argue that our demography, 10 years out, even 20 years out, we know pretty much what it's going to look like, and we need to do things differently. So what frustrates me is the lack of political understanding and the willingness of our political decision makers to think about what the implications are and to plan for them.
If this continues, what is going to quietly break in New Zealand first, do you think?
Say that again?
If this trend continue, this projection, if it continues, what is going to quietly break first?
I think there's a couple of things. I think the ageing of the society, and so we will quite soon be what's called an old dominant country, where over 20% are aged over 65. There are big chunks of the country which are seeing hyper-aging, which is more than 30% of the population aged over 65. And when you get, we'll as a country as a whole, we'll eventually plateau at around 25%. But when you think about the past, where around 7-8% of the population are aged over 65, and we're now talking about 20 or 25%, a lot of things change. And of course the costs go up, the cost of healthcare, the cost of superannuation, the cost of providing services and infrastructure for older people. And there's something called the old age dependency ratio, which is the ratio of people in work compared to those on superannuation. which over my lifetime, depending upon how long I live, will go from 6 to 1, 6 in paid work to 1, to possibly 2 to 1. So how can you afford the costs of an ageing society? So I think that's going to be very significant in terms of how we operate, how we generate income, particularly for the state, and then how we spend that income.
So there's a lot of big questions. Like, this is a podcast for business owners and entrepreneurs, and a typical 30-year-old entrepreneur who wants to start a life or start a business in New Zealand, should they or should they not right now?
I think they should. I mean, I'm not an economic expert.
We know, yes.
I'm a demographer. But, you always, when things are challenging, is the moment when you innovate.
Right.
And so don't spoil a good crisis is essentially my advice. So no, innovation, and we desperately need innovation in this country because we're very reliant in terms of a number of sectors, and of course the primary sector, which has done us really well over a long period and is continuing to contribute disproportionately to the well-being of this country. But we need to innovate. And I'm an orchard owner in Hawke's Bay, so I'm part of that sector. But what strikes me when I look at our ports and I see all those logs going as logs overseas, my question is, why aren't we adding value in this country? And that applies to a lot of our primary sector products. So why can't we innovate in that way?
If we're talking about building wealth in New Zealand, it used to probably be easy to build wealth in New Zealand back in the 70s, 80s and 90s, where the house prices were reasonable. Potentially now, how do you see a typical person wanting to build wealth? Is it becoming structurally harder in New Zealand to build any? And how long does it taken us 3 times as long to do that?
It is, because the costs have gone up, and so I look at the cost of housing. So I bought my first house in the late 1970s. It was double my annual salary, and so we've hit a high of, the average cost of housing is 9 times the income of a household, not of an individual,
a household. Everybody. Yeah.
Yes, of everybody. So when you look at that, and so for one of the questions I continue to ask is, why are women in New Zealand deciding not to have children or only to have one, the one and done effect? And of course, it's it's economic. It's the cost of living and owning property, owning goods that you want, cars or whatever else, versus the cost of having children. And I don't think we factor that in enough at the moment. So the economics of living have changed, and they've changed internationally. It's not simply confined to New Zealand. I mean, I'd have the same conversation about the jobs that my children, who are in their 30s, are getting. I would have the same conversation about the affordability of housing, in London or Sydney, or, the same debates are being had around the world. And the question is, one of the interesting questions, and J.B. Weir did some research last year about the cost of intergenerational transfers. So I'm a baby boomer, so my generation has a lot of personal wealth. Not all of us are wealthy. There's still poverty and there's still people who are struggling economically. But I'm the wealthiest generation, or part of the wealthiest generation that's ever lived. And one of the questions will be, how much of that wealth will be transferred to my children and grandchildren? And we don't know the answer to that yet. I mean, there's a debate in our household with my sons about about spending their inheritance. So we travel, we do fun things. Yeah, and so it's quite interesting conversations about, hang on a minute, isn't that supposed to be something that we will inherit? It's a joke. It's a joke conversation, but it raises a very fundamental and very interesting question.
Do you think they will inherit?
Yeah, of course they will.
Yeah,
of course they will.
That's good news for them then.
Yeah.
Do you think we are drifting into, New Zealand is becoming more of a retirement village in the South Pacific? We're just just a lot of wonderful, mature, older people, and that's just how the way goes. And obviously I don't know.
We are, but we're not. We're like every other high-income country. So there are 38 countries in the OECD. Nearly all of them look like us.
Right.
And we are actually at the back end of the queue. So our fertility's dropping later than most. Our ageing is not as advanced as Germany and Japan, which I would suggest are about 30 years ahead of us. So it's a common issue of having a very large proportion of your population in the older age groups. So if you and I were having this conversation 30, 40, 50 years ago, we would have been talking about an age profile of New Zealand being in a pyramid shape. And now it's very much obelisk. So actually the younger age groups are getting smaller and smaller as a proportion of the population. The older age groups are getting larger and larger. So that issue of becoming a retirement village as a country is actually something that nearly all high-income countries are facing.
What are we pretending here that this is fine? Like, whoever is pretending, somebody out there is pretending that how we're running, how we're making decisions, how policies are being made is actually fine. But it isn't fine. To some extent, someone has to be like, okay, we need to change how we do things. And I feel like, are we being naive as a country?
I'm not sure naive is the right word I would use, but I think we need to look at our institutions and particularly our decision making. So I think, and I'm being naive here myself, because I don't think it's going to happen, but I think there are some elements of this country and economy that need to be depoliticised. So infrastructure would be one, superannuation would be another. I think I would make an argument that elements of our demography need to be taken out of the political sphere, and there need to be bipartisan approaches to these things. So if we take superannuation, and it's a perennial, it comes up nearly every election, should we increase the age of superannuation eligibility to 67? Should we means test it? And you'll notice that we never get to the point where governments are prepared to make a decision. And I think it's partly, well, I think there are a number of factors, but a couple of important ones is the 3-year cycle. So governments are looking at essentially getting re-elected within that cycle and not thinking about 5, 10, 15, 20 years out. So how do you overcome that? I think the second thing is people's participation in decision making. And so I'm part of COI2 with Sir Peter Gluckman. We're very interested in the way in which people are involved in major decisions. So yes, political decision makers, but how do communities get involved in those decisions? Are there digital means or citizenship panels, which other countries have used, that might actually contribute to more inclusive and better decision making that thinks long term? So for me, I wouldn't use the word naive, but I do think we need to look at how we make decisions in our institutional processes and whether or not those are hindering some of these big decisions we need to make.
What does all this mean for a business owner who's running a business? Maybe there's 5 staff, 10 staff, 50 staff. Yeah. How are they implicated in this? And we'll get to what do we need to do to, I suppose, work towards solving that issue, whether it's at a grass level or a higher level, and what can people do about it?
I'm really concerned about the small and medium enterprise sector, the SME sectors in New Zealand. I think we're facing some very significant changes to labour and skill supply in this country. So the talent pool that we get. At the moment, we're supplementing that by relying on immigration. But we do need to look at whether or not our education and training system is preparing people for work in the 21st century. So if I look at SMEs, there's a couple of things. We used to do repeat surveys of employers in what was called the Northwest sector, which is Rodney, North Shore and Waitakere. And a couple of things surprised me. We asked what their skill requirements would be 5 years out. Most employers could not tell us. So we brought it back to 3 years, and even then a lot of employers struggled. So when you're thinking about future labour and skill supply, and you're thinking as a business owner with 20, 30, 50 employees, we, and I'm talking as part of Massey University here, but we, the education training sector, actually need a lead-in time to meet your needs. And 5 years, I think, is about a minimum. So we're not aligning what's happening in terms of our labour market with actually preparing people for this future labour market. But we're also going to see a shortage. So Business New Zealand last year conducted a survey, and what they show is that quite soon, so within the next few years, the level of demand will exceed labour supply. So demand and supply will start to cross over and then diverge. And so the figure they came up with was that we would be short of 250,000 people by the late 2040s. And that's a common problem around the world.
Right.
So one of the key challenges, I think, for our business sector is, where am I going to get my workers from? And what are they going to look like? Are they going to be adequately trained? Do I need to train them? And so I just think that labour supply issue is going to be critically important.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned 2040. I like to travel in the future. So if you take us to 2040 right now, what would my listeners now be living in at that time?
Well, there are aspects that, like AI, which I'm not even going to claim to know about, so put that to one side. But in terms of you being a business owner at that point, first of all, your market, suppliers and employees would have changed very significantly. So one of the things that New Zealand is experiencing at the moment, as a result of all the demography that's occurring, so the baby boomers, my generation, are exiting out of the labour market, but the people entering it are much more culturally diverse. So one of the things you're going to encounter is that in terms of the education sector and the people that are coming out of that into your firm, there are going to be a lot more Māori, there are going to be a lot more Asian. So we've just had to revise our figures around the proportion of New Zealanders who will be part of one of the Asian communities. And it's gone from being 25% in that 2040 date to 33%, 31.7% precisely. So those are going to be your customers, your clients, your suppliers, and they're going to be your workforce. So how are you preparing for this much greater cultural diversity? You're probably going to have to want to look at underutilised groups that are underutilised in our labour market. That would include Māori, that would include women, that would include the over 65s. More and more of us, 65 is no longer the age of retirement. More of us are working beyond the age of 65. And more of them will be immigrants and will be the children or descendants of immigrants, so members of minority, ethnic, language, faith communities. So your world has just become that much more complicated by this cultural diversity. And in terms of corporate New Zealand, I think they understand this and are preparing for it. But of course, our economy is dominated by the SME sector, and I'm not sure that many in that sector either understand what's happening or are anticipating and preparing for it.
So that's in terms of labour and in terms of who you're going to be potentially working with or who's working with you. But what about the number of babies they're going to be, the number of couples they're going to be, the number of older people they're going to be, and how is it going to all fit in 2040?
Well, I mean, in 2040,
right,
meeting the needs of older New Zealanders is going to be huge, because first of all, we've got to acknowledge the size of the baby boomers and the fact that the numbers of over 65s are just, they're going to be much larger, but they're going to live much longer.
How much larger?
Well, going from 8 to 25%. So
Right.
huge.
So
huge.
2.5 out of 10 people will be
Yes.
65 and over.
65 and over.
Right now it's
It's 18% at the moment. So it's
1.8.
climbing, yeah.
so it's only a few points more.
Yes, but remember that we're talking about young. The over 65s, nearly half of those between 65 and 69 are still in paid work. A quarter of all those over 65 are in paid work. So we're very high. We're just as high. We're about the same as Japan in terms of the proportion of the over 65s. So you're not beginning to see the effects on the labour market yet because the 65s are staying on and work.
Right.
But they're going to exit. And when they do exit, where does your replacement labour come from? And increasingly that is, of course, immigrant labour. At the other end of the spectrum, because of the decline in our fertility, what we're seeing is the drop in the number of primary school enrolments. Within 5 to 6 years, that will flow through into secondary schools, drop in secondary school enrolments. Following that will be the drop in people exiting the education system and coming into the workforce. So the numbers of younger New Zealanders are getting smaller. That's true as a generalisation, but for Māori that's not true. Their fertility is still quite high. So they will make an increasing proportion of the school age and then the working age population. And it's likely to be in that 2040 date that a third of all people in our education system are Māori by self-identification, by that's their primary cultural identity. So that suggests quite significant changes in terms of, who lives in this country, but who is coming into the workforce.
That's good news to hear about the Māori population going higher.
Yes.
That's quite a relief. I imagine would be the opposite. I would say, it would be even lower and lower, but it's really good news.
No, their median age is younger. Māori women are still having children at a younger age and having more children. It's dropping, but it's certainly quite different to others in this country, other communities in this country.
So we're painting a picture in 2040. There's going to be less babies. There's going to be more older people and less people going into the education system.
Yes.
Because there's less children being made. And what about... So is this where all the robots coming in? Because we were expecting to have...
Yes.
I don't know how many robots.
We've done a little bit of work, but again, our work on the labour market's a little dated now, but we started in the 1990s, and what we looked at that time was what we called non-standard work. So part-time, contract, third-party, portfolio, a whole lot of... And of course, that's no longer non-standard. That's what is standard now. Most people work part-time, contract, fixed-term, portfolio work. So things have changed quite dramatically over the last 30 years, and I think will continue to change largely because of technology. Our benchmark was within 20 years, half of all jobs would have disappeared, but there would be new jobs. So some of that will be concentrated in particular sectors. And I've always argued that the people-to-people skills will be super important and we'll need more of those. But if you think about the ageing population, we need more elder care workers. We need more elder care facilities. We need more retirement facilities. We need more nutraceuticals or pharmaceuticals for older people. There's a whole lot of new demands that are going to be made, and that's a business opportunity. All
right, you guys, I want to tell you about one resource that I look into and check all the time. It's helped me in my own business journey, and it's made me a better business owner, a better podcaster, helped me stay on top of all the business news that are happening in New Zealand. It's called NZBusiness Magazine. It's one of the New Zealand's oldest and most trusted sources for business stories, insights, and analysis for SME owners and leaders. So we've partnered together to help bring these kind of conversations like this one to more Kiwi entrepreneurs across New Zealand. So if you want to stay on top of what's happening in business, visit nzbusiness.co.nz today. Hello, thanks for watching this video. Quick note, have you subscribed? Over 90% of people who are watching on YouTube or listening on Spotify or on Apple are not subscribed or following. Please do so now. It's so simple. The button will be around the screen somewhere. You either hit subscribe or hit the follow button or leave me a review. It will help me so much, helps me grow as a channel and support my work. So I really appreciate it. Okay, back to the episode. 2040 is an interesting number that it's in the future. We want to be ready for that phase. A lot is going to be changed then. For a business owner or entrepreneur listening to this, thinking, the government, what are they doing to think long term? You were just saying that they're not thinking long term as they should. What are they thinking right now that isn't helping us? What should they be planning and thinking to help us? And then what should we do that is outside the government's initiatives or whatever? Like you were talking about having network and stuff like that. So what is the government doing that is actually not long-term thinking to start with?
So I think a lot of our current policies are historical. So if we took population funding for DHBs or transport or roading, what you tend to get is an allocation which is based upon the population of a particular area. What we need to acknowledge is that that's no longer an appropriate way of funding core services.
Why?
Because what we see is high demand in some areas, but low population. So there are parts of the country which are hyper-aging. Those parts of the country need dementia units. They need critical care beds. They need elder care facilities. And what we see in terms of the government is that what tends to happen is that funding tends to follow population. So big centres get much more funding. And to some extent that's logical. But when you get a very different demography, you're going to have to think of things quite differently. So if we take something like the old age dependency ratio, which is the proportion of people in work compared to those on superannuation, when it drops from 6 to 2 people in work compared to those on an old age pension, superannuation in New Zealand, then you need to do things differently. And I just don't see that occurring at a government level, saying, well, governments need to innovate. And I'm not seeing that innovation. I'm not seeing that strategic thinking. I looked at the long-term plans of local authorities. So there are 67 in New Zealand, and we can ask the question why we need 67 with a population of 5.3 million. But they're required to say what they will provide in 10 years' time, so sewerage, libraries, whatever. But what strikes me as rather peculiar is that the demographic analysis, what will those communities look like in 10 years' time, is by and large either lacking or it's rather naive in terms of its thinking. So we've been through a period of very significant population growth, pre-COVID, post-COVID. So 2019, 23, 24. And if you base your population on those years, then it gives you a very incorrect view of what is growing in terms of population. And I see a lot of that in local government in New Zealand. And that's why I think we need new thinking. We need new leadership. We need new institutional processes for thinking about some of these issues. I think that we need to fundamentally rethink how we generate income for the state and then we spend that income. What should it be our priorities? Are they the same as they were 10, 20 years ago? No, they're not, because this new demography is changing things.
What other moves being done in the high level that you're seeing, like specific examples that are not necessarily leading us well to 2040?
I think we need a population policy which brings together declining fertility, ageing, the reliance on immigration. If we don't have immigrants, we don't get population growth, we don't get labour supply.
What does that mean? Meaning the policy mean bring more people?
No, it means specifying how many people. And so we've gone from a year, 23, 24, where the numbers of arrivals, 253,000, is the highest ever. The net gain, 130,000, highest ever. And now this year, we're down at 11,000 net gain. So we've gone from 130 to... Well, that volatility doesn't help anybody. So can we smooth out that volatility and bring that together? In that, there's one thing we haven't talked about, which is where people live. Nearly half of all population growth on an annual basis occurs in Auckland. So people want to talk about percentage growth in Selwyn or Queenstown Lakes, and it's growing. But it's not. But the numbers that are being added is small compared to the numbers being added in Auckland. So by that 2040 figure, we would think probably north of 500,000 people will be added to the Auckland population. It'll probably mean that about 40% of all New Zealanders will live in Auckland, and about 3/4 will live in the top half of the North Island. Is that a good thing? I don't think it is. And I think, why don't we have regional policies which keep people in place, which help employers in our regions, which anticipate future skill demands and make sure that people are being trained and educated appropriately for those regional economies. And we dampen down this concentration of growth in the top half of the North Island, particularly in Auckland. There's a golden triangle, which Auckland, Hamilton, Tauranga, and those are the three growth nodes. And that golden triangle is actually where a lot of New Zealand, both economic but also population growth, occurs now. I don't think that's a good thing for the country.
More people need to be out in the extremities, in the regions. Like more people, like it's helpful for us to be moving out of Auckland and Hamilton and Tauranga and go into other parts of the country heading to 2040, is what you're saying.
I think we need to look at keeping people in the regions,
right?
So that there are people who are prepared to work in that local economy and those local businesses. There's a bit of a mythology in New Zealand that people are pouring out of Auckland, and that was certainly true during COVID, where the net loss to other parts of New Zealand was running at 12,000. It's now 3,000 and has declined significantly. So while that was a thing during COVID, it's not a thing now. And if I'm sitting in a regional economy, let's say in Hawke's Bay, I think I should be concerned about my competitiveness in terms of keeping people or attracting people. And I'm talking about workers, essentially. So we've seen a big drop in migration. The only beneficiaries of that have been Auckland, Hamilton and Christchurch. So all of those three are growing, but a third of our regions are now in population decline. So when we don't get immigration, we don't get population growth, and of course we don't get labour supply or skill supply. So I think the dynamics have changed quite fundamentally, and so immigration becomes one of the key levers that we can actually use.
I've, for a very long time, understood and believed that more people need to be leaving Auckland to live in the other parts of the country. Yeah. I don't know why that is. But
No, it's a mythology. There's a degree of boosterism which occurs. So people, I encounter it quite a bit. We did a book called Rebooting the Regions. So we did quite a few regional surveys, and people would say, why would you live in Auckland? You know, traffic, cost of housing, whatever else. And then they would point to the person down the road. They've just arrived from Auckland. Yeah. And they would use that anecdote as an example of what they thought they saw happening generally. And there's certainly a moment when there were people leaving Auckland in more significant numbers. But that's not a thing at the moment in 2026. So I think we just need to be careful. When I talk to politicians at the local or national level, what strikes me often is how often they use anecdotes when in fact the data says something quite different. Right. So let's be data-driven. Right. And I think that's true for employers as well.
Are they just lacking data? Do they not have enough data to base their actions on?
Well, if you're an SME in New Zealand, you're working hard to make sure that bottom line is attractive and productive. And so I just think some of the questions that we're talking about now a little bit of an indulgence for some people. They just don't have the time or the space or the ability to think about it.
For 2040, like, we want to get to 2040 prepared and well. Like, I'm thinking about myself, if I'm my age, that's someone who's in my life, stage and all the rest of it. We're thinking, okay, I've got a family, got a business, or got an orchard, or I have whatever, and I want to get ready for 2040. The government is doing good things, but there's also things that are not, there's not a lot of strategic long-term thinking, and I'm not interested in politics at all. But as business owners, we need, like you were talking about, needing to have a network. I would love to understand some of the practical things that people can implement right now to work on things right now. Like, what can we do?
I think there are a couple of things that I would suggest. One is that you access data and you try and challenge your thinking. So get people who will do that for you, get people in to speak. And, a lot of us do that, but it strikes me that we're not reaching very significant parts of the country. So, a lot of my presentations will be in the main centres. Regional New Zealand needs that thinking and needs that innovation at a local level, and anything that can be done in those economic development agencies, which are typically run at a regional or a city level, that begins to think strategically and make sure that their employers and their sectors in their region are exposed to that sort of data. I think that's super, super important. The second thing, which I do a lot of work around...
Sorry.
It's all right. I do a lot of work around immigration. The thing that strikes me is that we select immigrants because of their skills, education, experience, and we don't fully utilise it when they come here. And one of the things that I think is underutilised in New Zealand is the contribution of immigrants to innovative thinking. So there's good data that shows that embracing diversity, understanding and embracing diversity, having diversity policies, including diversity, equity and inclusion policies, using the diversity of your workforce in particular to generate innovative answers is super, super important. There is a direct relationship between diversity recognition and inclusion and economic outcomes. We can show that McKinsey have done that very clearly. So I just sense that that's one of the things that employers need to be doing. When we talk to employers, for a long time employers said, there are two groups that I am not particularly interested in. This is a small and medium enterprise. That's a school leaver and an immigrant. And when we asked them about the immigrant, they said, well, language, health and safety, there are a number of reasons. I was part of an EDA which said, we'll fund employment in your firm for an immigrant for 3 months. And what we discovered is the employer said, actually, that immigrant employee is pretty damn good. They've got a good attitude towards work. They actually are beginning to contribute to things that are happening in my firm. And so I just think there are some things which employers need to think, do I have expertise that I can access externally or even inside my firm that I'm not doing at the moment? And I think immigrants would be a prime case in point.
I was thinking about the 90s and today, and I'm sure you were on top of things in the 90s and today. If you take us back now to the 90s, 1990, and now, what do you see the biggest mistakes that we have made as a country that made us not ready and behind in some things like economy and keeping people in our country?
Yes. I'm not sure that New Zealand can keep people in the country. I think we're always going to see people go, and that as the economy dips, then we see more people go. I think that's inevitable. I would dearly love our government to have a diaspora management much more effective diaspora management. So we've got north of 1 million Kiwis living in other countries, 600,000 in Australia. What are we doing to connect them back with us? We don't expect them to come back and live, but what are we doing to use their expertise, their skills, their networks to help us as a country? So I think that's one thing that I would do.
Can I ask why that's important?
Because we've got some of our best and brightest going offshore. When you look at diasporas in the OECD, first of all, we have one of the highest. So as a proportion of our population living in another country, it's second only to countries like Ireland. It's really high. And the second thing is our diaspora is one of the best educated of any diasporas. So our best go offshore. And you can see that in the numbers. There's a spike in the 18, 19-year-olds leaving, that's a school leaver, and then the 24, 25-year-olds, that's our graduates. So they go and live in another country. So why can't we use that expertise in a way that benefits us? And so countries do that. I mean, the Philippines does it, India does it. There's countries that have very active diaspora management programs, and it really benefits the economy and country. I think the second thing is that we haven't adjusted our education training system for this new economy. And I was a Pro-Vice-Chancellor at Massey University. Our BA, we wanted it to be, our BA graduates to have good problem solving, good communication skills, understanding of modern society, being entrepreneurs in their own interests, so being entrepreneurs in how they approach the labour market. And I think people think that content's important. It's not content, it's transferable skills. So how can we improve New Zealanders' transferable skills? So we adopted the OECD figure, which said that most people would be doing between 16 and 18 jobs over their lifetime. And that would be not simply different employers, it would be different jobs. So how do we prepare people to manoeuvre around these big social and economic changes which are occurring? So how do we do that? And how do we backfill and match between demand, what employers want, and our education training? The mismatch is really problematic in terms of our society. I think the other thing which strikes me about the 1990s and what we're seeing at the moment is that we changed our immigration system in 86, 87. The 90s were a disaster.
Why? Because
we hadn't thought about what we needed to do to match the migrants we selected with labour demand. So we had a lot of people who came in, and, again, anecdotal stories of the taxi driver having a PhD and whatever. And we had, of course, a very major political and negative political reaction to immigrants. So New Zealand First, about 93, New Zealand First was established and came into power in 96. And I think that raises another question, which is around social cohesion and helping immigrants settle here. So Canada does this really well, which they help migrants settle. They provide 400 hours of English language instruction, free, to help them settle.
Was that back in the day? Or
no, currently.
They do. Okay, they do.
And we don't do that. We don't.
Oh, okay.
We don't help migrants transition to a New Zealand setting.
I must say, the whole language debate, it's going to piss some people off right now, but I'm just going to say it. I can't tell you how many people I've come across who have businesses, all sorts of businesses who don't speak English. And whether that's been their negative, like their mistake, or the government not enforcing it, saying if you're coming into New Zealand, you need to be able to speak English.
Yes. But we do enforce that, but it's only for the primary visa applicant. So we don't do it with the rest of their family. And that's why we get a lot of non-English speakers. But you see, I would say that should be seen as a positive because we've got people who can then communicate to that particular language community,
right,
and do business with that community.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And I think one of the things, I'm a trustee for the Chinese Language Week, and one of the things that I don't think we do particularly well is embrace language diversity and see it as a positive. We tend to see it as a negative. And countries that are, you can actually again see good evidence that shows that recognising and embracing language diversity by a country, let's take Switzerland, so 4 languages, actually adds to their economic vitality, innovation and productivity. And so we just need to adjust to this new world of cultural diversity and language diversity and ways. But I think your point is a good one, and that is whatever other languages they speak, they need to speak English.
Yeah, exactly.
And so what are we doing to help them do that?
Like, please speak your language. It's so important.
Yes.
You need to communicate with your own people.
Yes.
At the same time, if you are in this country, if I'm going to be in France right now and have a business, I need French.
You do.
I can't. How do I operate without learning the language?
Yes.
I want to understand from you in terms of the financial progression of the country, more like the financial progression of individual Kiwis. Like, how wealthy are we able to be leading up to 2040, and what can we do about it to prepare ourselves?
Well, I think a big concern for us in New Zealand is our decline in productivity. So one of the things we do is we use immigration. I'm very much in favour of immigration, but at times we use immigrants to avoid having to confront issues of technology use or productivity gains. And I would see that in the orchard sector. So we use a lot of technology in the packhouses, and it works really well. We're right up there. But in the orchards, we don't. We rely on recognised seasonal employee workers, RSE workers, to come in from the Pacific or Asia to pick our apples and our grapes and whatever else. But why aren't we thinking about new productivity gains? Why are we using immigrants as a substitute? So we need to incentivise people to think about productivity and productivity gains. And I've been involved in the science sector for a long time,
right,
and in funding science projects,
right,
on behalf of the government, by the way, since the 1990s. And the thing that really concerns me is that we need to do that science and research and development in order to help our employers. And the government needs to play a key role in that, and I think we could do much better. I think we could do much better in terms of incentivising employers, particularly big employers, corporate employers, in terms of doing some of that research and development, tax breaks, whatever that might look like. And the government needs to fund innovation. And all we need to do is look at a country like Singapore and think, wow, that's what an innovative modern economy looks like, and that's what their science and research and development sector looks like.
You're talking about productivity, and I think there's many definitions of what that means. And was it okay if we just backtrack with that and help me understand again, what does productivity mean in this case, and why do you think you're concerned about that?
I think it's productivity is about the labour invested for the returns that you get, and what I think in this modern environment we need to do is say what will help increase what we do by way of producing particular goods, services or infrastructure, using particularly technology. I think we need to be innovative and to look at utilising everything that's available to us. So what concerns me is that we often go for a short-term sugar fix, such as immigration, to fix a gap rather than thinking, could we actually do this
Right.
onshore
Right.
using new technologies in a much more effective way?
So we're not using technology as well. One of the things that we're not doing as well to get ready for 2040.
Yes.
Is-
I mean, that's a generalisation because there are
Yeah.
parts of New Zealand which are doing really well.
Yeah, of course.
And I mean, if you look at the dairy sector and particularly dairy farms, then they're using technology, much bigger farms, much bigger herds, and to produce more and with fewer people. So, there are, I don't want to overgeneralise.
No, of
but
course, yeah.
as a country, I think productivity gains have not been
As fast as it
fast
should.
as they should, no.
Yeah, not as fast as they should.
No.
And we don't talking just about the primary sector, like
No.
farming and stuff, but also the small to medium-sized businesses,
Yes.
perhaps the adoption of AI with the bits and pieces, because that really does help productivity.
It does. And I think AI is both a challenge but also an opportunity. We need to think, how can it be useful for us? How do we utilise it? At the same time, I mean, there are going to be job losses. So how do we accommodate that? And I did a paper for Cabinet which looked at how you retrained people. So people who'd been in a job and that job was lost because of new technology, what is your obligation or what are opportunities to help retrain those people? So I suggested the Swiss system, which is where you build up an annual credit, and that credit, the cost of that credit is borne by the employer, by the state, and by the individual concerned, and you could use it to retrain. So you gained new skills which would be more appropriate in a new labour market. And I just don't think we've built in that flexibility and opportunity to retrain that we should. I just think the old ideas, if we go back to one of your earlier questions, the old ideas that education is linear, primary, secondary, possibly tertiary, and labour market, no, it doesn't happen like that. We need to retrain people throughout their working life.
And that's not really happening as such.
No.
Like in a consistent manner throughout the country.
No. We tend to... Our education and training investment is very largely focused on the compulsory sector and then on the immediate tertiary sector.
And then people have to go and sort themselves out
They do.
and fund for themselves. And
They
those
do.
people who have different priorities or budgets constraints, they wouldn't choose to be trained. And then therefore you have a drop in skill levels, and then that's the labour market issue.
Yes. And you have people excluded from the labour market, people who have not been retrained, and so they exit the labour market and don't come back into it. And that's just a huge capital loss for us as a country.
Can we talk about the networks that you were discussing earlier before we end? In terms of you're a business owner, you're an entrepreneur of various levels. Doesn't matter what level you are. If I am in a startup or a 50 person tech company, and I want to be ready for 2040 in a different way, in an innovative way. You were talking about data. We need to be educated about data, and I feel like I might have missed the other point. So if it's okay to recap what we could do in a number of steps on how we can prepare for 2040.
There's a very interesting book and an approach called The Geography of Jobs. And what's interesting about jobs is that what you do during the hours that you work during a day is really important. But what are the other things that fit around that in terms of having a lifestyle that you want? So, for example, can you access good quality healthcare education? Is there a decent barista down the road? Is there a gym that you can go to? Are there some concerts or some other things that you can do? And so people think that partly because of COVID, that people want to go and live in the countryside or a smaller centre because it gives you a quality of life. And it does. However, when we look at it, the job growth and all of these add-ons which become really important tend to occur in our major cities at the moment. So New Zealand, like other countries, is seeing this move out of the countryside and into the cities. Again, we're quite a way behind the eight ball on this. If you go to a country like France, the depopulation of the French countryside is huge. So there are just not people living there. And if I can give an example, we actually do go to France on an annual basis. In our small village, when we first went there in the early 1990s, it was a village. Now there's one remaining permanent resident.
Oh.
There's no health facility anywhere except if you go to the nearest large village, you can be hooked up to a machine, and some medical professional somewhere else in the rest of France does this diagnosis by distance. And I think that's quite an important issue for a country like us. I would like us to make sure that we fund and keep facilities in our smaller centres and in our regions that keep people in place, which goes back to a point that I feel very strongly, is that we need regional development policies which address these sorts of issues.
So the networks, is that what you meant by networks?
No, sorry.
That's okay.
The networks I'm thinking about is sometimes they come through co-location. So you get people, businesses which are co-located and which work together to help each other to become more productive, to become innovative. That tends to occur in our major cities, not in our second or third tier cities, or even, and certainly not in our rural regional areas. So for me, a network is about having an opportunity to step outside of your business, to engage with other people who are doing something similar to you, or perhaps people who are doing something very different to you, and thinking about some of the challenges that you're facing, some of the opportunities, some of the responses to that, and getting that external view, getting that external expertise or advice or wisdom that you can use in your firm. It strikes me that when we were doing repeat surveys with employers in the northwest sector, that a lot of them were very static in terms of their thinking and what they did and how they did it. And actually it didn't take much to say to them, well, I think you need to listen to, might be your podcast, might be something else, and think about, well, is this the best way of doing this? And can I do it differently? Can I do it better? And that opportunity to expose yourself and to look at what other people are doing and how they're doing it and what might work for you becomes super, super important. So how do we generate these networks? How do we encourage these networks? Is it self-generated? Is it me being interested in what you're doing and having coffee with you once a month and saying, look, I've got this real problem? So there are mentoring systems, but that's part of it. But I just think that the way in which we innovate, and how do we support this SME sector to innovate, to think differently, to understand these strategic challenges, to understand, in my case, the demographic change. I mean, what we're going to be doing in 2026 is going to be very different from what we're going to be doing in 2036 because of nothing that we can... it's not a result of what we do, but it's happening around us. And so then how do you respond? So networks of influence, networks of expertise, networks which help people open up the possibilities, I think become really important.
And it is important indeed. And I think what's really important is having these conversations and understanding what's going on in 2026, and having you, Professor, on the podcast has been a really good to have you and good to understand your point of view and your enlightenment and insights. Final words for my audience, please.
There are huge changes coming. Don't be overwhelmed by them. Understand them and understand the opportunities.
Perfect words to end it by. Thank you so much.
Thank you.